No team in the entire NBA has invested as much in winning over the last couple of seasons as the LA Clippers, and they have 0 50-win seasons and 1 conference finals appearance to show for it. And the strangest part of all that is I fully believe they've had a really good basketball team the entire time. The beginning of this, of course, is them trading for Paul George and then eventually also signing Kawhi Leonard, bringing those two guys together in LA and trading as much away as they did for Paul George, as well as the opportunity to sign Kawhi. All these future draft picks that run now through 2026. Other key pieces of the team that was there before Kawhi and PG got there, as well as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's now a borderline first-team All-NBA caliber player with the Thunder. And those things coming together, that's the level of investment that they began with. Like, the team before Kawhi and PG got there were decent, and they kind of had the same kind of regular season in terms of a record standpoint that the Kawhi and Paul George teams have had. And they invested all this other stuff in terms of draft picks and the money as well. This has been one of the most expensive rosters in the entire league. They paid a ton in luxury tax. Steve Ballmer wants to make this a competitive team, especially before they move to their new arena, and they just have not been able to figure it out. It's almost like people are forgetting. It's almost like people are just not talking about it because they've been so in the middle from a record standpoint for the last few seasons since they made the conference finals 2 years ago. And the fact that they're this invested, that they put this much into it, whether it be their future, whether it be money, and they still can't win any games, they can't have a legitimate finals run, blows my mind. And again, the weirdest part of all this to me is the fact that from a roster construction standpoint, they've done a really great job. You have Paul George, you have Kawhi, two guys that are fantastic in terms of two-way players, perimeter scorers, especially in the playoffs. Like, both these guys' playoff numbers when they play are unbelievable. They have a ton of switchable wings, guys that are a little bit bigger that you can play even all the way up to the 5 with guys like Nick Batum. They brought in guys like Robert Covington. Norman Powell is a little bit of an explosive scorer. They've got shooting. They've got depth at the 5 spot. The only thing they've really missed for pretty much the entire time is a legitimate lead point guard, whether it be Reggie Jackson or now Bones Hyland. They've never had like an all-star caliber lead guard, but when you have guys like Kawhi and Paul George that everything's running through, you don't necessarily need one of those guys. But of course, the problem with all of this, the reason they haven't had any success is because they just cannot stay healthy. Now, granted, this is something that I talked about at the time that they made the Kawhi and Paul George trades. Everybody just assumed that the risk there was the team not being good enough, the risk with trading away all these future picks. The real risk was the fact that the season before they brought in Paul George, 1, he was awesome, but 2, he had a couple of major injury issues. Of course, he's got the rod in his leg from the Pacers injury. He has the shoulder injury that he had multiple procedures. I think he had a procedure on both shoulders before getting to the Clippers the year before. And then Kawhi, of course, was someone that, with the exception of the fantastic year that he had in Toronto in that postseason run, had all of his injury concerns leaving San Antonio. And then even in that postseason run in Toronto, there were moments where he was like limping around on the floor because of some leg injury issue. And when you have those two guys together as the foundation of your team, sometimes disappointment is going to follow. But the thing that has happened with this team is it always happens at the worst possible moment. How many postseasons now is it in a row that we've gone without seeing both of these guys together on the floor? The year that they made the conference finals, they only made the conference finals after Kawhi got hurt with some kind of weird knee injury that ended up keeping him out for a very long time. And Paul George was fantastic, led them to the conference finals, ultimately fell short against Phoenix. And then this year, Paul George hasn't played either. The year before, Kawhi didn't play. It is unbelievable the amount of bad luck here, but also maybe there was an understanding of that when they brought these guys in, given their injury history. So the question is, now what do you do? If you're the Clippers and you haven't even won 50 games, like, that's not, like, it's a pretty good accomplishment, but like, their record right now has been like the Washington Wizards of mediocrity, but like the peak of what the Washington Wizards, like 48 wins, 44 wins. Like, that's not super team level winning percentage. That's not, like, 50 games is not that big of a deal for a team with this level of talent. And when you can't even get to, a top 3 seed in the conference, and you can't get to multiple conference finals when you're this invested, the question has to start coming up in your mind if you're Steve Ballmer, if you're the general manager, if you're the coach. Like, at what point do we just pull the plug on this? Like, this is ridiculous that we can't figure it out and get healthy, and maybe we just need to go in a different direction because they're trying to do everything they can to prop up this particular team, and it's just not working. Now, in terms of the roster, they can run it back. So Plumlee isn't expiring. and Russell Westbrook isn't expiring. Other than that, everybody's back next year, and Paul George and Kawhi both are basically on one-year contracts. They each have player options 2 years from now. Generally speaking, guys will decline that player option. Obviously, the health stuff, you never really know specifically with Kawhi, but they can run it back for basically one more year and then see what happens with Kawhi and Paul George's respective player options. And it feels like the way that they've constructed the roster, the way that they've extended multiple players, including Paul George and Kawhi, it feels like that was always kind of the plan. Like, let's do this one more time, see if we can finally get the injury stuff to go well, and then you figure it out. And if that isn't the plan, I really don't know what you do, because you're not going to get great Paul George level value if you trade him away. Same thing with Kawhi. And even if you move both those guys, it's still such an expensive roster, and it's a roster full of veterans. There's no young pieces here. You can't trade a draft pick until 2028 and beyond. There's really no other option here than just running it back. Now, I say that, but anytime you really want to, do something badly enough when it comes to a trade in the NBA, there are ways to make it happen. If they really wanted to just sell extremely low on Kawhi and on Paul George, they would have that opportunity. But again, the disappointment here comes more from just not being healthy. I fully believe that if you eliminate the bubble from NBA history and you make this Clippers team healthy the entirety of the time that Paul George and Kawhi have been there. Those guys are playing 70 games a year. They're playing all throughout the postseason. They make at least one finals, maybe two. They might have also won a title. The bubble specifically was really, really not good for the Clippers. Before the league got suspended, I felt like they were one of, if not the best team in the entire league. Obviously didn't go very well in the postseason. They then reconstructed their roster even more, getting rid of guys like Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams to get in more defenders, more wings, more two-way players. Again, just continually investing more and more in the roster, despite the unbelievable expense, especially from a money standpoint. And then Paul George gets hurt, and then Kawhi gets hurt, and then Paul George gets hurt, and then Kawhi gets hurt. And I fully believe that if you just turn the injury switch off, they've constructed one of the better teams in the league. It's just not one of the more consistent teams in the league in terms of being on the floor. If you were to run it back, option number one thing that you would want to upgrade the most would be some kind of guard creator. Like, Russ has been unbelievable for them. One, because, at least in the postseason, because, he suddenly decided to try again on defense, but also just having someone that can get to the rim on occasion as a guard is really helpful. So whether it's Russ and they retain him or they try and find somebody else, that would be option one. Like, if you want to continue to invest and you want to spend, your 2028 first round pick bringing in a guard, like, that certainly would be helpful to this roster. But overall, it's just consistency. It's trying to get through the year, and it's trying to be healthy. And that's what it felt like they were doing this year. And it just did not work out for them for whatever reason. And at the end of the day, if I had to guess, I think this is what's going to happen for the Clippers. You're so invested in this group. You've come this far, you're going to try it for at least one more year. I mean, again, they've got the new stadium. They've got, this big plan on how to make the Clippers the team in LA basketball wise. Obviously, that's a bit of a pipe dream, but you can still at least try and do that. And I don't think they're just going to reverse course all of a sudden, even though it is unbelievably frustrating the way the last few seasons have gone. They're probably going to run it back. And this exact situation we're in with the Clippers right now, where they're this theoretical super team that when you look at them on paper, they look like they have every single piece you could possibly want, specifically in terms of depth and top tier talent as two-way players. We're probably going to be right back at that same point next year, assuming these guys once again get hurt. And the most frustrating thing for me, as well as I'm sure for Clippers fans, is it's not like the disappointment is as a result of maybe Paul George not being great in the postseason, as he, had some struggles with at times in Oklahoma City, or Kawhi, being a little bit run down because of the injury issues. When they're healthy and they play in the postseason, their playoff numbers are out of control, ridiculous. Kawhi's numbers on a per game basis in the postseason illustrate a player that is, since his 2019 run in Toronto and then on now to this point, the best postseason player in the entire league. And that is one of the biggest things that gives me confidence in saying that, like, they could have been a multiple time finals team. And of course, you have to start bringing in the idea that this is the Clippers and maybe they're just cursed. Maybe it's just not meant to be. And maybe you do have to move on. And that's where I land with this, is that even though, yes, they gave up all this stuff, they gave up SGA, they gave up all these picks, they spent a ton of money. It's still not even really the wrong choice. Like, they gave themselves multiple opportunities to be a great team, to win a championship, to make a finals, and they ultimately did make a conference finals, which is an accomplishment for their franchise. And even though it hasn't gone well to this point, and even though some of the assets, SGA specifically, have been way more valuable than anybody thought that they would be at the time you traded them away, you still had a chance. And had things gone a little bit differently, we could have been looking at this Clippers era way differently. I think it's going to be a very interesting debate in the long term, how people talk about this team as a complete, abject failure, rather than they took some swings And had it worked out, things could have gone entirely differently.